frequent consultant of government agencies and think tanks, including the Woodrow Wilson Institute, the Brookings Institute, USIP, the Middle East Institute, and the Council on Foreign Relations. He earned his BA from Swarthmore, a master's degree from Harvard, and earned his PhD from Princeton. He has appeared on many news outlets, including the PBS NewsHour, the old Charlie Rose Show, Al Jazeera, Frontline, NPR, BBC Radio, and other outlets. And he often publishes in foreign policy and Middle East policy. So the way that we're going to structure this is, first of all, for those of you who are joining us in the webinar, we do want to get to your questions, and you'll see on the bottom of your screen there is a marker for Q&A. If you write your questions into the Q&A, after Dr. Ali and I have asked some initial questions, we will turn to yours and we will be asking them of Dr. Landis. And in addition to that, we thought it might be interesting to run a poll question for you this morning as well, this evening as well. So if you hit the poll button, you'll see that there's a poll available for you to take. We're actually going to be asking you two poll questions, one at the beginning. So go ahead and hit the poll question now, and you can input your answer if you like. And then when we wrap this up, we'll be asking yet another question. The poll is now in progress. And the question is, should America discontinue its relationship with Saudi Arabia and allow countries of the Persian Gulf to fend for themselves? And I can see that some people have already started to join the poll. So that's terrific. All right. So with that, go ahead and also write your own questions. And we'll turn to the we'll turn to the results of the poll a little bit later. So let's now turn to Dr. Landis and some initial questions for you.
Well, before you do that, let me just thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's a pleasure being with both of you, and I look very much forward to our talk. I want to thank UC Riverside and Palm Desert for hosting this, and I look forward to speaking with your viewers and answering as many questions as I can.
Yeah, some of you may remember Dr. Landis, who came out to speak with us about 6 or 7 years ago. So this is a bit of a repeat performance, but nothing in the Middle East has stayed stagnant. So I'm sure that we'll have new things to talk about. Among the first things, Saudi Arabia was important then, and Saudi Arabia is important now. And the initial question that I have for you is, why does, if in light of the United States producing so much oil recently, why is the United States still so hooked to Saudi Arabia in terms of its foreign policy when we have become increasingly self-sufficient on our own fossil fuel supply?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's one that's obviously very, very heatedly debated in Washington today. Let me, in order to facilitate an answer to this, let me shift to a few little maps and slides that I have momentarily, because I want to speak about, can you see that? No.
Not yet.
Okay, perhaps I should be doing just 1 second. Let me see if I can share the screen. That's what I need. It says only host. Okay. Right.
Can we make Josh a host?
There. It looks like I am now.
You're the host.
Let's see. Can I share it at any rate? Yes, I can. Okay. I'm going to share. And I want to. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Excellent. Now, here you are looking at a map of what Winston Churchill called the hinge of fate, World War II. 2 battles, Stalingrad in Russia, El Alamein in Egypt. And the reason I'm showing you this map is that it's important to think of oil and energy as a strategic commodity, not only as something that we consume. Because in many ways, oil helped the Allies win World War II and defeat Hitler. Hitler's main two big battles was driving towards Baku on the Caspian Sea, which was the center of Russian oil production. And also, Rommel's Desert Rats was speeding across Egypt from Libya, and he was stopped at El Alamein by the British. And of course, the Russians stopped him at Stalingrad. This is what Winston Churchill called the hinge of fate. It turned the tide of the war. It kept them from getting oil, and his panzer units and airplanes came to a halt. And ever since then, the United States has thought of oil as a strategic commodity that it wants to control. And that means controlling the Persian Gulf. And I'm going to, here is a typical map that was created right after World War II. I spent a lot of time in the British archives, the American archives, researching a dissertation on the Middle East right after World War II. And I found lots of maps that looked like this in the British archives, because the British were in charge of Middle Eastern defense after World War II. And this is what the Americans and the British thought was going to happen, that the USSR could launch an attack to get Middle Eastern oil. And the United States began to set up the Northern Tier, Turkey into NATO, and Baghdad Pact. There was a number of efforts to restrict and to dominate the Middle East. And that has turned into today, of course, we originally lined up with Iran, Turkey, Pakistan. And that was the Northern Tier. And America poured arms into those three countries. They were meant to block the underbelly of the Soviet Union. We had NATO in Europe and SEATO, and MITO was supposed to be the Middle Eastern Defense Organization. Now that has evolved over the years into what we have today as CENTCOM, because after we lost Iran and the United States began to build up Saudi Arabia in a crazy hurry after 1979, President Carter came out with the Carter Doctrine, which is that anybody who tried to mess with oil in the Persian Gulf would be messing with America. He set up CENTCOM, Rapid Deployment Forces, and today we have between 70 and 80,000 troops in the Middle East. And we dominate the Persian Gulf. And we're, pressuring Iran to try to keep them from spreading their influence around the Persian Gulf. And that's because in the event of another war, and let's say China were to take Taiwan, the United States could easily shut off China's access to international oil. And much of China's energy supplies come from Iran, and Saudi Arabia is the biggest provider. But those could be shut off through the Persian Gulf, and China understands that. So the moment that America decides, let's pivot away from Saudi Arabia, is the moment that the United States agrees that it no longer wants to be the, great world power. And that's something that Americans like being. And every 4 years, our presidents say that they're going to make America great again, or something of that nature. And they talk about being the indispensable nation. And Americans like this. They want to be number one. And so it's very difficult for Washington to let go of that strategic commodity, oil, which could be the decisive factor in a World War III. And let me make a little addendum here, because you can see, if we look at the distribution of world proven oil reserves, 50% of those world oil reserves are in the Middle East, right in that Persian Gulf area, as you can see on the left of your screen. 50% of the oil reserves are there, 40% of the proven gas reserves. So the Middle East is extremely important. And it's not only that they have that much of the known world oil reserves, but as small nations, Saudi Arabia is about 30 million, Qatar, Kuwait, only a few million. They export most of their oil. Unlike the United States, which is the largest oil producer in the world, we consume everything we produce because we're just oil guzzlers. But the Middle East exports it. So exported oil what's really important here, because that makes the market for the world, and the Middle East dominates that. And Saudi Arabia is the linchpin because it's the second largest oil producer. Russia is right up there. They've been trading places recently. But Russia and Saudi Arabia have been in constant oil talks to try to bring down supply and mitigate this collapsing oil price. But they're the two countries that are really trying to regulate the price of oil in the international community. And you can see the top 10 oil producers here on this chart. The United States is by far the biggest today, and that's a very recent phenomenon. Saudi Arabia, Russia are right behind, and Canada, China, and others are far behind. But you can see on this chart what fracking has done to United States oil production, because it has increased it by about 5 million barrels a day from 2008. And it has screamed up, and we are now producing more oil than we've ever produced before. And just recently, we've increased by 140% production since 2008. And in November 2018, the United States exported more oil than it imported. And that's been a long time coming. So you can see, I won't go through all these charts, but you can see what, how the United States, both in oil and gas production, has been, its consumption and its production are getting close together. On this one, which only goes to 218, but in 219, those two lines crossed up here, and that meant we were producing more than we were consuming. And so the United States doesn't need Gulf oil. We could relinquish Saudi Arabia and have plenty of oil, but that's not what it's really about. It's about the strategic aspects of oil, and that's what makes it so tricky to try to move away. And let me say one more thing about the world oil consumption. Many people think, oh, we're moving towards non-fossil fuel energy production, whether it's wind or solar, nuclear. And that's a little bit true. But look at this map of what oil consumption is happening. And this only goes up to 2005, really, 6. It's been continued to go up. We increase our oil consumption in the world by about 2 million barrels a year, 1.5 to 2. Of course, that's not been true in the last 6 months, but it is going up. And even though what we see on this thing is that you can see where the others, the renewables are a small fraction here. And that's, everybody's waiting for renewables to begin to push out the rest of this stuff. It's unclear when that's going to happen. The problem is that the world is adding 1 billion people every 12 years. We're at 7.5 billion now, but in 12 years we'll be at 8.5. So all those people coming on to the world stage want oil. And not only that, but hundreds of millions of them are moving from poverty into the middle class. You think of China, India, Turkey, South America, Brazil. Tons of people are getting big houses. They want 2 cars. They want to live like Americans, which means consuming oil. And that means that oil will be in demand for a long time, undoubtedly.
Mohammed, do you want to take the next question, or should I do a follow-up here? Okay, I'll do a follow-up here just so I can understand this. So what there was a question in the from the Q&A that is also related to this. So I hope that you sort of expand on this a little bit. The question is, what's the likelihood that solar, wind will, and other kinds of
Well, here, the BP, the head of BP, British Petroleum, just said in the Wall Street Journal, was quoted, "We may have already seen peak oil." Now, this is, I think he's a little bit in coronavirus shock saying this. And he's, of course, not really saying it. He's just saying it's possible. But last year, British Petroleum predicted that peak oil consumption would grow over the next, it wouldn't be until probably the late 2030s that we would begin to see a decline in oil consumption. And that's because of greater efficiencies, but also because of the fairly rapid growth of non-fossil fuel sources of energy. And they're coming on quickly, but as we know, the cars are catching on, but people want to drive, they want to drive long distances in the United States. They don't want to just go 300 miles. And there are other, everybody's got a house. And they're not going to change, it takes a long time to change your habits of consumption because there's a lot of infrastructure that's got to change. All of our American roads, all of our airplanes, it's going to be a slow, I think that people are optimistic when they say that in 20 years or that in 10 years or 15 years, we're going to see peak oil.
And that's in terms of the United States, but insofar as it will remain cheap for it'll be cheaper for other countries to use it. It will always be a necessary relationship with the Middle East because of the cheap price of oil. Even if we should sort of supersede our own need for it, other places will continue to use it. And then, so that's one element, the consumer element. And then you were saying that the other element is sort of the World War III scenario, which is that whether or not we need it, for military purposes, that oil is cheap and necessary, and therefore that also has
and industrial reasons. I mean, the world revolves around oil. It still does. The Industrial Revolution is on oil. In 1911, the British Navy switched to oil from coal and steam, and all of the navies in the world run on oil. And I guess there's some nuclear power as well, but the world goes around on oil. So having the hand on the spigot really makes you a superpower and puts you in control of the international economy. And we can guarantee free flow of oil to allies, but we can also stop it to enemies. And we've seen that, in the way we've sanctioned Iran and shut off their oil exportation. We've sanctioned various countries. In Syria, we don't let them import oil. They have a very difficult time, and many, electricity is only going on at about an hour a day, 2 hours a day. So it's within America's power to crush countries through the control of that spigot, as well as to, alleviate and regulate the world economy. I can't hear you, Mohammed. I think you've got your mute on. Yes.
All right. So we had here one of the questions. Considering the fracking, right? How has fracking changed the oil situation? You already mentioned it. You already talked about about this. If you want to say something about this.
I think that the fracking has revolutionized, certainly in America, because it took us from being big consumers, very dependent, and now we are producing 13 million barrels a day. That's gone down a little bit since the virus struck and prices really collapsed. Because what's happened since, well, let me just stick for a second with the fracking. This has allowed the United States to add about 5 million barrels a day to its production. And that really, America is the cause of the oil glut in the world. Saudi Arabia has been producing around 10 million barrels a day for a long time. So has Russia. Russia has increased since the fall of communism because they've gotten more capitalist production. But it is the United States that has really ramped up oil production. And we've got to remember that Iran is under tight sanctions. Their oil production was about 4 million about a year and a half ago, barrels a day, and now they're exporting less than 1 million barrels a day. Libya, offline. Venezuela is crashed. Venezuela has one of the largest known oil reserves in the world. So those three countries could be producing, but America has really taken up that slack. And that's why the oil market is so soft, and that's why the coronavirus threw it into such chaos. I mean, it did it anyway because world consumption fell by a third. World oil consumption since Corona hit fell by 1/3, which is why prices went from $60 a barrel to $20 a barrel. They just plummeted. And the international community, Russia and Saudi Arabia and OPEC got together and they said, okay, we're going to cut production by 10 million barrels a day. But the United States is still producing at this lickety-split pace because America's got thousands of oil companies. They can't make, because it's a capitalist system and it's not one oil company like Saudi Arabia or Russia or Iran or Iraq, they can't regulate production. So the only regulation is the marketplace, and that means that the companies have to go bankrupt and start losing money. And that's why it's bust or boom in America, because there is no regulation and nobody at the spigot to turn it down slowly and moderate prices. We have to lean on Saudi Arabia in order to get that kind of control over the oil market. We depend on Saudi Arabia to tighten its belt and to decrease supply when prices go down in order to try to control it. So fracking has had a big, major impact, certainly for the United States, but also for world supplies. And that technology will be spreading out to the rest of the world increasingly.
Right. So we'll go to the question and answers later on. We have still a question for you to answer. Now that we have the coronavirus, right? How has this coronavirus crisis affected our American national security outlook and Middle East policy?
Well, you know, let me just turn to this next slide. Well, I'm going to jump ahead because the question really merits a national security. I think that the coronavirus should accelerate thinking about U.S. commitments abroad. You know, this could be, in some ways, it could, if we want to look at it in the most positive way we can, the U.S., the coronavirus may help fix U.S. grand strategy. And what do I mean by that? Because, you know, I don't expect the coronavirus to lead to radical disarmament or isolation, because it shouldn't. But the United States has gotten itself into this position of being policeman of the world, where it stretches its power to every corner of the globe. And I think that's going to be a much harder sell in the future. The U.S., in my opinion, needs to abandon its notions of a liberal hegemony. And that's both Democrats and Republicans agree that American power should be used to create a liberal world order. My sense is that coronavirus is going to push us to abandon that dream of a liberal hegemony. You know, America has assumed that the Muslim world could be Americanized, and we've attempted to turn it into our image. And that has failed, I think, spectacularly over the last 20 years, something that many people are beginning to grapple with and question what it is we should be doing in the Middle East. But I think coronavirus, by focusing on the damage that can happen here at home and the fact that we're unprepared at home, that we should be spending a lot more of our money to upgrade institutions and infrastructure at home and not be spending it so profligately abroad.
Michael, you might have a
Sorry, yeah. I'm just I'm looking here in the Q&A, and some of their questions are very good. So I'm going to actually throw one at you, which is it goes back to the strategic question: for how long do you think America actually can keep China out of the Middle East? And sort of piggybacking on your last point, which is that our liberal hope of our hope of liberal hegemony, it does not seem to be working. Do we have a strategic hegemony that's going to be able to continue, or do we have a time window? Is there a window in which we're becoming less and less influential?
You're absolutely right. We're becoming poorer, and that's, it's not absolutely poor because we know GDP is continuing to rise, or at least we're getting a bump here, but hopefully it will continue to rise. But it's comparative. Obviously, the United States is now, as a percentage of international GDP, the United States has been has been shrinking since World War II. And, at the end of World War II, the United States, I think, had more than 50% of the world's capital. We were exporting everything. We were the big manufacturing center. And that has changed, and we've seen it change very rapidly. China has come up strong, but many other countries are coming up strong. And we are moving increasingly to a world where spheres of influence are being reintroduced. And we need to go back, I think, to trying to balance, find a balance of power and use things like balancing Saudi Arabia and Iran instead of trying to crush one and make our ally the winner in the Middle East, because that's not working out very well. And I think if we see what's going on in the Middle East since the Arab Spring, the United States misinterpreted the Arab Spring in many ways because we looked at it through our own point of view, which is that this is the fourth wave of democracy. And our political scientists had told us, well, there's a first wave with the French Revolution, the American Revolution. There's a second wave as, the rest of Europe. Then there's Eastern Europe, and there's Latin America. And then it was going to be the time for the Middle East to become democratic. And George Bush thought that by kicking down Iraq's doors and regime change, he could introduce a domino theory and create democracy throughout the Middle East. And that was with regime change. But we know today that this policy, let me just flip forward a little bit, because this policy over the last 20 years has been a disaster. The notion that the US could successfully promote democratic values worldwide has turned out to be a big mistake. We thought that non-democratic regimes that were opposed to American influence could be sanctioned and threatened with force. And if that failed, the US could use its powerful military to remove despotic regimes and impose democracy, as we tried to do both in Afghanistan and Iraq. But that regime change didn't turn out very well. And today, the number of violent extremists is infinitely greater than it was when Al-Qaeda first emerged and when the war on terror was announced. The Middle East has seen a rapid decline in the standards of living in many of its countries. Political rights are in retreat. Authoritarian regimes have grown stronger. And where they haven't grown stronger, they've collapsed into civil wars. Globally, the number of authoritarian regimes has increased. Relations with China and Russia have soured. Democracy is in retreat in many places. I mean, one could go on with a sort of, the costs have been tremendous. 7,000 of our soldiers have died in the Middle East in the last 20 years. The financial costs are estimated about $5.6 trillion, if you include in healthcare and everything else. The US has 800 bases around the world. It has defense pacts with 69 countries, and the defense budget is eating up our discretionary spending and dwarfs that of the next 8, 9 other countries. If America's global footprint was reduced, many people in Washington, of course, would lose their jobs. And so we go on pretending that the U.S. is all powerful. And that's, that leads me to agree with people like Paul Kennedy and Stephen Walt and a number of others who've called for sort of a return to notions of balance of power and the politics of the spheres of influence. And I suppose that's a big answer to your question, but
it's actually that's a question that somebody asked in the Q&A. So can you, spheres of influence isn't a term that we've heard since the Nixon years. So tell us, what do you mean by spheres of influence? What would an American sphere of influence look like? What do you mean by that?
Well, after the fall of communism, Washington saw, we remember from the Bush-Cheney years, but also it's even before that, the United States believed that it could have 20, 30, 40 years of being the single hegemonic power in the world. And part of the Cheney defense strategy was to make sure that other countries could not step up and compete with us. And that got us tangled into all kinds of places that we shouldn't be, with too many soldiers in a too ambitious, just way over ambitious. And, Paul Kennedy called it imperial overstretch. So what we're seeing, I think, is return in the last few decades to a 19th century European world where there were spheres of influence, because we've got a lot of new powers like Russia taking Syria, we've seen Ukraine and so forth. It has etched out its sphere of influence. It's been working on Turkey, bringing Turkey to its side. China's doing the same in the South China Sea and Asia. The United States is not going to be able to keep all of those, keep its position as the dominant power everywhere. It's going to have to pick and choose. And in doing that, it's going to have to set up alliances with other countries in order to counterbalance countries like China. And that's going to require a lot of delicate diplomacy and not so much military might and not dictation. And it's going to require America to be much more humble in its demands, because we're going to have to compromise and make deep compromises with other countries, that many of which we don't particularly agree with, don't have our same governing system. And it's going to require a lot of finesse.
So has the State Department lost its ability to think and act strategically in the Middle East? What do you think about the role of the State Departments?
Well, if we look at President Obama's policy towards Iran, which I think was the best we could do in a bad situation where you have two competing powers. You've got more than two, but let's say we take, for the Persian Gulf, you've got Iran and Saudi Arabia as the major competing powers. Iraq used to be a major competing power, but today it's imploded because of the invasion. So the United States needs to balance those two countries, it seems to me. And that's what President Obama was trying to do. He's trying to avoid war with Iran and step back, fund Saudi military efforts to build up. That was good economics, but it was also a way to counterbalance Iran without strangling Iran, and to try to bring Iran into the international community so that Iran would increasingly see the advantages of diplomacy, because it wants to join the international community. It wants sanctions lifted. Iranians want to eat well and join the world community. And that, I think that effort to balance these two countries was much wiser than President Trump's return to helping our friends and hurting our enemies in a very simplistic way, which is maximum pressure on Iran, try to starve Iran into regime change, into uprising and collapse, which is where I think Washington is headed, is a regime change in Iran. And I think that'll just bring more chaos to the Middle East. I think even if we're successful in that, and we might be, it'll be a disastrous success. We'll rue the day. If we get what we wish for, it'll be a terrible mistake, because Iran could fall into civil war the way Syria has, or Afghanistan. It could become chaotic like Libya or Yemen and one of these other places. Who's to say that you're going to get a better outcome? You could get a much worse outcome, which has been the case in almost every other regime change effort we've undertaken.
Okay, we're getting a question from the Q&A, and they want to know who to vote for. So, so now, if you can, and if you have any idea of what it is, what has Trump's policy been, if there is one that you can articulate? And then what do you think Biden might do? How might he pivot American policy?
That's an excellent question. One of Biden's Vice President Biden and presidential hopeful Biden, one of his leading advisors, Blinken, came out with a Syria policy just a few days ago. And his policy mirrored Trump's. I mean, I couldn't see any difference between it. He says we've got to keep control of the oil, Syrian oil. We've got to keep our troops in Syria. We've got to help Kurds, but he was very vague on how much we help them. And we've got to keep Idlib province, where there's 3-4 million people, rebels, keep it autonomous and protect it from Assad. So essentially, it was to keep pressuring Assad to leave power, and a better outcome, as he put it, for Syria. And a better outcome means getting rid of Assad. So he's going to preserve that policy. On Iran, there has been talk about returning to Obama's Iran deal, but they're also talking about getting a better deal. So they want it both ways. They don't want to look weak, which they're frightened of being accused of being weak on Iran. So they want to be tough on Iran and get a better deal, but they want to also return to the Iran deal. So it's a hedged bet. It's not clear how much different a Trump would actually be. Biden would actually be from a President Trump. And you remember that Trump said he was going to do very different things. He said he was going to withdraw from the Middle East. These were stupid wars. Regime change was stupid. Strong men were what the Middle East needed. And democracy promotion was a fool's errand. Those were sort of his catchphrases during the campaign. But he backed away from most of those because I think that foreign policy elite in Washington is very powerful, and it wasn't worth his energy to try to really change the direction of American foreign policy. And we've seen since Clinton, Bush, Obama, that it's been very difficult. Despite efforts by President Obama to reduce and pivot to Asia, it's been extremely hard for the U.S. foreign policy establishment to do that. So I'm not sure, to finally answer your question, how different a Biden foreign policy will really be. But there's going to be pressure to spend less, no doubt about it, to trim the Defense Department budget and to bring some of the troops home.
Yes, one of the voices, beyond the United States, we always hear that, why don't you just, United States, take care of yourself, just focus on your domestic thing, instead of thinking about us, instead of going to us and trying to control us, right? So that's, retreating from Middle East and all the world, and then focus on the domestic problems here in the United States. What do you think about that?
Well, obviously the United States needs to reposition itself because we're spending way too much. We've gotten ourselves in over our head. We're overstretched. I don't think it should go into isolationism. There's got to be a more prudent middle. But it's very difficult. Having been since World War I, really, the dominant power in the world. It's extremely difficult to give that up. And we're not going to do it willingly, I don't believe. It's going to happen because we can't afford to do it. And other countries become strong and they carve out their spheres of influence. And that's where I think we're going to see that first in the South China Sea, in efforts to police little islands around there and so forth. And already the United States is scratching its head about what to do and trying to work with allies. But that's something that the United States is going to have to do a lot more.
Okay, some more from the Q&A. So, and you brought up at the Arab Spring before, so I think it's time for us to sort of talk about the Arab Spring. It so happens that Dr. Ali is an expert on Indonesian democracy, so he's very familiar with Islam and democracy, but Indonesia is not the Middle East. So what are your thoughts about what happened in 2011? Your own expertise is Syria, so you can talk about the debacle there. But I also wonder if you could throw it in comparison to what happened in Tunisia, where it seems to have been successful.
Yes, well, Tunisia is the exception in many ways, that gives us hope for the democratic turn. But we have to, I think, after a sober look at what's happened, is seen that it has not taken a democratic turn in the Middle East. And that has I think there's a number of causes for that. One, and perhaps very importantly, and I'd like to know, Professor Ali's opinion on this, is that many people in the Middle East were not calling for democracy. Of course, the more secular elites, everybody wanted greater freedom. And that was the main slogan, was Hurriya, freedom. And Isqat al-Nizam, down with the dictators and the regimes that were ruling in the Middle East. But there was not a call for democracy that was articulated loudly by the crowds. That was articulated by some of the more secular elites, particularly those in Washington. But it wasn't the big call amongst the demonstrators. And that was for a very, I think, strategic reason, which is that many people in Egypt and Syria and other places want an Islamic form of government. They want greater Sharia law. And in order to make a big tent, the organizers stayed away from democracy and questions of what kind of regime you're going to have next, in order to keep both seculars and Islamists under the same tent fighting against the regime. They stuck to a simple basket of slogans, which is down with the regime, freedom, these sorts of things. More bread, more economic, so forth. We want change. And that America did not, I think, almost willfully close their ears to that Islamic call, and way overestimated the power of the Democrats and the more secular elites. And we've seen this in time and time again on the part of the United States. In 2006, the United States forced Israel to accept elections with the Palestinians, and the Palestinians voted in Hamas. And then America had to help with Israel organize a coup d'etat against Hamas and to build up the PLO once again. That's happened in Egypt, where elections brought Islamists to the fore and the Muslim Brotherhood to the center, but there were also big Salafists to the right of the Muslim Brotherhood who got about a third of the vote. So, and that's also true with the Syrian uprising, where America thought they would get a moderate rebel coalition together, but in fact the Islamists became the most powerful coalition. And this is, this is where I think America's failed to understand popular sentiment in the Middle East. And it's also for economic reasons. I mean, the Middle East is extremely poor. In Egypt, about over 45% of the people are living in poverty and have, dangers of not having enough food. In Syria today, it's higher than that. But also the Middle East is extremely young. And if you look around the Middle East, in the West Bank and Yemen, the median age, in Gaza and Yemen, the median age was less than 20. It was 19. In Syria and Iraq, the median age was 21. Egypt, it goes up a little bit, 24. Tunisia was 30. And in all the political scientists who've crunched the numbers, they argue that the chances for democracy to consolidate after an uprising like this, and to not only have a momentary democracy, but a democracy that persists through 3 elections, the median age is 30. If you have a younger median age, it's hard to stick democracy. And that's partly because if you have a revolution in a place like Yemen or Gaza, the high school is going to take over. The median, these revolutionaries are extremely young. They don't know. They're not cautious. So the revolutions that took place in the Middle East were not, the probability that they were going to bring forth democracy, I think, was not great. And we've seen, worse regimes that are more authoritarian take their place, like Sisi in Egypt. And what's happened in Saudi Arabia, the crackdown in many of the Gulf countries that have become more authoritarian. Or the countries have fallen apart, like Yemen, Libya, Syria. Iraq, of course, is in shambles. There's been a real decline in per capita income. Poverty rates have gone up through the roof. The number of migrants and refugees pouring out of the Middle East, whether it's Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, other places, is just, is expanded exponentially. And so that rather dreary picture is, the pressures could mount up. And if a country like Egypt failed, which is close to 100 million people, it would be a real disaster for the Middle East. Of course, it'd be a disaster for Europe because, it would make Libya look like nothing. But the United States and the Western world can't afford many more disasters like that. And that's a problem that I think is going to stretch into Africa and other places, because as the world becomes more and more competitive, we see lots of winners. And this is not a dreary story, because China, hundreds of millions of people have moved into the middle class, India, so forth. But there's also been a lot of losers. And just the way we see in America, a yawning income gap, where over the last 20 years, a lot of people have gotten richer in America. But there's a lot of people who've struggled and gotten poorer and are being left behind. And I think that's also true on an international scale. You've got countries, particularly in Africa and the Middle East, which are struggling. Bad government, divided communities, weak institutions, and they haven't invested properly, either in education or in development, and they are struggling today. Whereas other countries are pulling ahead at an incredible pace and growing at 6, 7, 8% a year with a lot of countries. So it's a very happy story for billions of people across the globe, but it's a very struggle. It's a great struggle for people, particularly in the Middle East.
Yeah, the COVID-19, again, really had this transformational consequences, right? Expanding the reach of the militias, the terrorists, the other actors who have filled government voids to provide services to local communities. So, hospitals and healthcare facilities have been targeted by these actors and fractions and sponsors and refugees you mentioned. It's really, COVID-19 is really a conflict multiplier. It makes things even worse and worsen.
Yes.
And humanitarian crisis, right? Humanitarian crisis is, you already mentioned it. And so in other words, we're talking about the competing authorities in the Middle East. You know that you had the governments, the authoritarian governments, and you have all these non-state actors trying to fill the gap. You know, the government void. If, for example, the young generations, right, the young generation plunged into poverty, it is very easy for them to to join the militias and become even make things worse, and that's what the pandemics really are making now. What do you think about that?
I think you're absolutely right, Mohammed. This is a force multiplier, the virus, and it's shut down Middle Eastern economies just the way it has done here, and it's been a double whammy in the Middle East, particularly the Gulf countries, which depend on oil, like Algeria as well. Saudi Arabia, gross domestic product is expected to fall by 2.3% this year. Now that's, compared with 5.9% for the US, 3% worldwide. And that the kingdom has mitigated that disaster by deficit spending. Like the United States, it's pumping lots of money into the economy. And that means that its debt to GDP ceiling it's had to raise it to 50% from 30% in order to pump that money. But Saudi Arabia is good. It doesn't have a ton of debt. It can borrow a lot against its oil reserves. So that's what it's going to do. But Lebanon saw its banking system collapse. It's expected to shrink by 12% this year. Lebanese are in a terrible shape. And it's losing billions every month because of coronavirus. Algeria just announced 2 days ago that it was slashing its government budget by half. In Egypt, the amount of people who go hungry, and 1/3 of the people in Egypt live on less than $1.50 a day. And I don't even want to mention Syria because it's so, it's just going to make you cry. But there, because of the civil war, combined with sanctions imposed by the US and also this coronavirus, the situation, the GDP fell from $55 billion 10 years ago to $22 billion. So the GDP has fallen by 2/3. The economy has shrunk by 2/3 since the civil war. And it's the same thing in Yemen. Libya, of course, is even worse. If you take these economic numbers, they're very, it's hard to console yourself. And people are in a very desperate shape, which is why the refugees are flowing out in such big numbers.
Okay, I'm going to share the results of the first poll. We have about 5 minutes to go. We have time for another question. But at this point, I'm going to share the results of the first poll, which indicate that at the beginning of the talk, when we asked the question whether or not the United States should discontinue its relationship with Saudi Arabia and basically let the Persian Gulf do what it fend for itself, 27% of people who answered said that's exactly what the United States should do. 49, almost 50% said no, and then about 22% didn't really have an answer to the question. So I'm going to stop sharing this, and we're going to actually relaunch the same poll to see if people have a different opinion at the end of the talk as at the beginning. So that's going to clear, there we go. So people who would like to vote again, change your vote, or potentially, yeah, we can see that I don't know if you're able to see this live the way that I am.
I can see it live, and you've got 125 people in your audience, it looks like to me, which is a lot more audience.
Yeah, let's see if we can get more votes in here. Now we're looking at closer to 25% of the people say yes, the United States should get out, and 71% say no, the United States should continue to stay in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia. Let me ask you a question regarding that specifically. So as you said before, in terms of the basic strategy, we have an animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And on the one hand, you were saying that our sanctions against Iran are not necessarily working, and that's a policy that shouldn't continue. how do we, what is your idea about how to handle that animosity between those two countries, given our relationship with Saudi Arabia? What should our policy toward Iran be?
Well, I think that the Obama policy was not a bad one, which was to use diplomacy and to bring Iran slowly, use carrots and sticks, but to reward Iran if it doesn't threaten its neighbors and it doesn't develop nuclear power. And, basically it was focused on nuclear power because that was the scariest thing for the United States and the surrounding powers. They did not want Iran to continue developing towards nuclear capacity, breakout. And it was quite clear that Israel was threatening to bomb Iran if America would not. And this was moving towards some kind of conflict that President Obama thought, I don't want to get into that. He came in, of course, promising he was going to get us out of the Middle East and pivot, and he was going to get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq, in which he didn't do either. But he didn't want to get into a third conflict with Iran. And so, hence the deal. Now, there's not a good answer for Iran. But if you look at Iran's budget for defense, it's extremely small. Saudi Arabia is much, much larger than Iran. Iran does not have an air force. Saudi Arabia has a very fancy air force with all of our best planes. Now, Iran has tried to counter that by developing missiles and good missile technology, which it's been doing. And we saw that most recently with its attack on the oil refinery in Saudi Arabia, which it used very sophisticated missile technology to destroy it. So Iran is finding ways around this. The thing is, Iran is now completely strangled. Its people are in terrible shape. Its economy is in terrible shape. And the United States is hoping that this will turn into regime change. My hunch is it's not going to turn into regime change anytime soon, and it's going to cause Iran to begin to attack the United States, as it has been doing in the last year, in order to try to drive the United States from the Middle East. And that it's having some success in Iraq. And so it's a game of chicken. And I'm not sure that that's going to be the best way forward, because it could lead to war. Or it could lead to the collapse of Iran, which could be another economic disaster. So Saudi Arabia can defend for itself. We have seen the United States trying to push Saudi Arabia and Israel closer together, which has been quite successful at doing that, and get Israel to play a larger role in the defense of Saudi Arabia and its allies in order to counterbalance Iran. America doesn't need to leave, but the region in any way, shape, or form. But I think it doesn't have to get into being the military of first resort. And there's where, depending on letting Saudi Arabia and Israel pick up a little bit of this slack, I think they can do it. They have infinitely bigger economies, defense budgets than Iran does. Iran is not, Hitler coming over the horizon. It's not that powerful a country, and I don't think the threat is half as large as what it's made out to be in Washington.
Well, we come to the conclusion here. It's been a graduate seminar in Middle Eastern policy. And I really thank those who participated in the Q&A, because most of the questions actually came from you today. I'm going to share the results at the end of the poll. Here, basically the same number of people, percentage of people thought that we should get out of Saudi Arabia as the first poll, but our second one, much more people are convinced that Saudi Arabia should continue to be an ally. Although your final words about that, about other countries in the Middle East taking up a little bit more of the slack of the relationship, is fascinating, not something that we hear a lot about. And so I thank you so much for coming here today. Ali, do you have any further comments or?
No, I think that's wonderful, and thank you so much. This is so so engaging and very informative, and at the same times, I hope that we could have more hopes, in the Middle East.
Well, things
Can
can
you say
change,
something about
things
that?
change rapidly. But I think that, the less America, American use of military force in the Middle East has not helped to stabilize the region. I think it's largely been a destabilizing force. And so it needs to be used more cautiously. Saudi Arabia is an important ally. We don't have a country that will replace Saudi Arabia. For Saudi Arabia to fall, it would be a real disaster for American footprint in the Middle East. And I hope I haven't. I think that the poll results demonstrate that I've made, in a sense, an argument for the strategic value of Saudi Arabia and energy in a larger world picture, which really ties America with golden handcuffs to Saudi Arabia. And it's a difficult relationship because we're so different. We don't share many values. We don't share, obviously, much political institutions. But it's a lesson in how we have to manage relations with a country that can be quite thorny, but it has worked closely with the United States. And managing that relationship is going to be difficult, and it's going to get more difficult as time advances. But I think that's one reason that we shouldn't box Iran in, which will only lead to conflict and, I think, more extremism in the region. We have to point a way forward for Iran so that it can join the international community, international banking. And I think that there are lots of elements in the Middle East, and particularly in Iran, that want to join the international community, that are tired of the mullahs running things. And one can just hope that over time, they'll become a greater force in the country, not unlike the Soviet Union, where change came from the inside because people realized the system was no longer working for them.
Well, I'm so glad that you came to speak with us today. As you know, but other folks may not know, I've been following your career now for 20 years, and I've watched you make calculations and predictions that then unfolded and became true in reality, much more so than anybody else that was speaking about, especially the Syrian civil war, among other things. So it is sobering, but also hopeful as you present your point of view regarding going forward. You have a way of just a very common sense, a way of sort of laying out the most important basic elements of the situation, which is extremely clarifying. So thank you so much for being with us today. And we also want to thank UCR Palm Desert for hosting us, and UCR Chaz. And if I may point out somebody especially helpful to the team today, Agam Patel of UCR Palm Desert has been invaluable for technical reasons and other. So
well, thank you both, and thank you for the invitation. So it was a real pleasure to answer your astute questions and to be part of your community.
Great. Thank you so much. And we hope to see everyone soon for another event to be determined. Take a look at the web page of UCR Palm Desert in particular, where this has been recorded, and in a few weeks it'll be posted. And check out UCR Chaz as well as UCR Palm Desert for events in the future. Okay, thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks,
Thank you.
Mohammed.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Josh. Landis, thank you.
Thank you, Ali.